folks from across the university get involved with this new degree, this new course. So we've got people from all sorts of places joining us this evening. And we're especially excited to be welcoming our guest speaker this evening, whose work is really closely aligned with kind of the heart of this degree. We've got this idea we're trying to build human-centered data science is like really core to what we're going to be trying to build into every single one of our classes. And trying to figure out how to do that well and thinking about data well is something we're hoping to teach with our students and something that we need great folks to help bring that expertise in. So another great professor here, Brian, who's been doing a lot of work since the, who's been doing a lot of great work since the, before this degree existed. He's gonna give a longer introduction to our speaker since they go way back. So let's welcome up Brian Smith.
Thank you so much. I think I'm just going to take I think I'll take 20 minutes or so to just.
And I would like to also give Laura Steinberg of Schiller Institute, the Schiller Institute's co-sponsoring this, and they've been a great partner in this event. She would give her warm welcome if she were able to make it, but she was called out last minute. So that's that piece as well.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thank you to those of you who are online. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Danah Boyd. Danah Boyd is a partner researcher at Microsoft Research and a distinguished visiting professor at Georgetown University, fellow Jesuit institution. Yeah, a little plug. She is also the founder of Data and Society, a nonprofit research institute that studies the social implications of data automation and something. It starts with an A and ends with an I. Perhaps you've heard about it recently. Danah is an academic and a scholar whose research examines the intersection between technology and society. And all that stuff before I said about partner researchers at Microsoft and everything like that. I'll never mind that. Danah is about to become a professor in the Department of Communication at Cornell University. So congratulations on your new position.
Thank you.
And I hope the house works out. Once upon a time, Danah was one of the first people, certainly that I knew, to really study the impacts of social media on youth, right? Really digging into questions about what are youth doing when they go on social media, particularly at a time where we knew very little about the effects of that on anybody. And there was a lot of discussion back then. A lot of times it was like social media is going to kill the kids, right? And then, or it's going to be a great thing, right? And Danah and her colleagues did groundbreaking work to really try to understand what are the effects of technology. How do kids use those spaces? She wrote a book called It's Complicated, The Social Lives of Network Teens, and also co-authored 2 books, Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out, Kids Living and Learning with New Media. Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out became to a certain research community, people would just call it Hamago. Hamago, right? And this had, still to this day, has significant meaning when people talk about that. In terms of, again, thinking about what youth do that's productive with social media, that's not, it sometimes counters what we do in the media. Also another book, Participatory Culture in the Network Era. Over the years, besides social media, she's written many papers on media manipulation, algorithmic fairness, privacy, teen drama, bullying, digital back channels, and social visualization design. And recently, she's been looking at really focusing on how contemporary social inequities relate to technology and society more generally. I saw Danah probably a year ago. She was giving a talk at an institution across the street. Across the river, I'm sorry. It's the one with the initials as opposed to the other one across the river. And so it was at MIT where you got an award. I don't know. It was like, greatest of all time. I don't know what it was. It was some kind of GOAT award that she got. It was like sociology.
It's STS.
STS. Okay. So she got this fantastic award and gave this wonderful talk about the census, 2020 census. I know that you were working on a book.
I am
On this,
working on a
right?
book.
Okay, and I remember once inviting her a couple of years ago, and I said, "Could you come give a talk?" She said, "Well, I'm working on this book. When I finish the book, I'll come." And you're still working on the book.
Yes, turns out there's been a few things that have happened.
I understand. Yes, several things have happened, but so she's still working on the book. So just hang out for that. I did get to see some of the book. Maybe we'll talk about some of that work today, but it's really fantastic work in the same vein as the social media stuff. She holds degrees in computer science from Brown University, PhD from Berkeley School of Information, and a master's in science from some joint across the river again called the MIT Media Laboratory. And that's where our story begins. I was a faculty member at MIT's Media Lab. You know what, a few years ago. It wasn't that long ago. Dana was a student there, a graduate student. I think probably I'd been there a year and then you came. We used to have these meetings, right? Faculty would get to have these meetings. We would talk about sort of the grad students, how grad students' progress has gone. Every once in a while, Dana's name would come up and somebody would say like, you know that Dana, boy, she's a real troublemaker. She's troublemaker. And this would come out quite a bit. You remember that? You better. And she would say, she's a troublemaker. And I remember being in one of these meetings and I was like, I don't know. I don't think she's that much of trouble. And then someone pointed out, they said, that's because you, sir, are a troublemaker. So trouble sees trouble as not being trouble. And so the two of us kind of made a lot of trouble together at the MIT Media Laboratory, which was fantastic. And really one of the things that and when you make that kind of trouble, one of the things that you do is, like I've always thought of Dana as somebody who really leads the way and trying to sort of think about how technology can empower versus harm people. I often talk about great technologists. What makes a great technologist, right? This is a great technologist. And here's why you're a great technologist. When you don't think about technology, you're a great technologist. Now it seems counter to, but when you are a great technologist, what you think about is what are the ways that people can make themselves better, that they can improve their lives, how to make communities stronger, how to make individuals stronger using technology, as opposed to thinking about technology as the thing, the end in itself, right? This is what Danah Boyd has done for her entire career. There's a quote, I found this on the internet now, so that may be true. It actually could be written by ChatGPT. I don't know. It's by Danah, so let me just read this. She says, the most important thing to understand is that technology in society isn't a field as much as it's a way of seeing. Okay, good. Like, just make sure it's chat box and make this up. And that a social technical way of seeing can strengthen any field out there and address some of the most complex problems in our society and work towards a more just world. So again, this is someone who's been looking for ages about how do you think about the combination of where does technology and society intersect and how do we actually do things to improve the human condition. So I don't know what she's going to say tonight in her talk. The talk, Here Be Dragons, the challenges of pursuing responsible AI. I've seen her talk many times, so I know that it will, whatever it is, it's going to be very inspiring. I saw this sentence in the abstract, and I want to pull this one out. How social technical systems are designed, developed, and deployed is not inevitable. It behooves us all to grapple with known pitfalls, minimize risks, and nudge the systems towards constructive ends. And I want to stress this point, and you're going to stress this point too, but I want to stress it because everywhere I go, there are people who will tell you, they will say, all of this stuff, it's inevitable. It's inevitable. The genie's out of the bottle, the cat's out of the bag. The train has left the station. AI is not going to take your job. Someone who uses AI, it's all this, I mean, you know, and I get in trouble because I go and I say, somebody in the film is looking at me going like, I say that too. Anyway, don't say that. It's just fear mongering. Okay. There are ways that we have influence over these technologies. And I'm absolutely sure that that's what Dana's going to be talking about tonight, about how we as humans, how we as designers can think about what is the role that we want AI to play in making the world a better place. And so with that, I just want to say, thank you for coming to Boston College.
Thank you for having me.
It is my pleasure to introduce a wonderful scholar, a fantastic speaker, and a dear friend, Dr. Danah Boyd. Floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. He didn't even make stuff up. I was like banking on him making stuff up the whole time. Much more fun. So thank you all for coming out here this evening. And I actually have decided that I will not torment you with census conversations because I'm living census conversations. But as some people in this room already know, you just get me started and we'll go really far into the census. But instead, I wanted to talk about some aspects of how I've been thinking about responsible AI and the broader conversation. Because I keep asking myself, what on earth does it even mean to design, develop, deploy, and use AI responsibly? There's so much in there to unpack. And I will get my clicking work. So in most critical spaces, when this conversation of responsible AI tends to come up, people focus on what it means to not be responsible, to immediately go to all of the problems there. And we start to hear a lot of those issues of like, what does it mean to be training that data on online content? What does it mean to be thinking about the environmental consequences of AI? Or what does it mean to think about how to deal with these larger corporate commitments and values? because there's a lot of entanglement here with capitalism. All of that is extremely important. And I want to, flag that these have been a lot of things of how I've been thinking about AI over the last couple of years. But in preparing this talk, I've been actually trying to force myself to think in a slightly different way, and to really challenge my own sort of knee-jerk critical space and sort of step back and say, okay, if I want to be critical, what are the kinds of problems and how do I start to break them down? And I realized that I could go back to an older project that I'd been working on with collaborators, where we were thinking about aspects of abstraction traps, and I'll explain that in a second. And we were thinking about that originally in a fairness space, but it also becomes important to think about it in an AI space. Because I think one of the things I kept coming to is, projects, large complex projects that involve coordination of large amounts of people and technology and practices, like, for example, democracy, are not something to be achieved, but they're a normative commitment that we're always working towards, right? And I think that this is what is important to think about what it means to be responsible. There is no checklist of responsibility. It is a commitment, a value system, and orientation that we keep working towards. But in working towards those ideals, we also have to grapple with the places where we might get stuck. And that's where I kept coming back to this traps question. So this paper, which is what I'm going to be building off of, actually began as a joke. So what happens when two computer scientists, two sociologists, and a lawyer walk into a room? And it turns out you spend a lot of time together, like just basically defining your terms. But Andrew Selps, Sorel Friedler, Suresh Venkatasubramanian, Jennifer Teshi, and I were really noting that there was this emergence of a conversation around fairness at the time. And of course, some of you might be familiar with the fairness, accountability, and transparency ecosystem. But we were watching this emerging conversation happening with no shared definition of what constitutes fairness, but a normative commitment to an ideal of fairness impossibly defined. So we wanted to sort of untangle this because we were seeing already some traps getting in as the machine learning community was really excitedly trying to implement in fairness. And so we ended up building out 5 different kinds of traps that technologists often find themselves in trying to build fair algorithms. And so when we were sort of looking at these, we started realizing we were peeling back the layers of an onion and trying to see how those traps built upon and were entangled with one another. So I went back to this paper and was thinking about it recently because I think that a lot of what we were saying about the design and development of those fairness algorithms are actually more generally relevant to AI. And so I'm going to do some translation work from this paper and think about those traps doing that. And as I was writing this talk and thinking about the aspects of what it meant for AI, I started to realize that there's another set of traps that are emerging that are not about as much about the designers or the technologists, but about the business people, about the different kinds of social critics, about broader issues at policy levels. So I'm going to give you 5 of the original, 3 new ones, and then try to offer paths forward. We'll see if it works. All right. So the first trap that we were really interested in is what we call the framing trap, which we defined as the failure to model the entire system over which a social criterion such as fairness will be enforced. In other words, if you try to really focus on like one part of the puzzle, say, try to making it ethical, it will mean nothing if you don't look at the broader ecosystem, right? You create oozes in all sorts of directions. So for responsible AI to avoid the framing trap, those who are really invested in improving the AI system need to understand the technology in its social ecosystem, because it's often the relationship between that is the problem. And this brings us to a really great concept in science and technology studies. There's a notion of the heterogeneous engineering concept, right? And it's a way of avoiding things like a framing trap. And so there's often a little misunderstanding about heterogeneous engineering. So let me start with the misunderstanding that is often deployed. The misunderstanding is that you just need to have all of the relevant stakeholders in the room and they can design it and it will be great. We've probably heard this, right? This is something that happens all the time in the development of these systems. But heterogeneous engineering goes beyond that, right? Which is to say that it's about purposely creating the conditions for constant contestation over the things where the friction lets you see where the disagreements lie, right? So it's not about getting everybody and enrolling them into the same script. It's about inviting that friction so you can see it, so that you're actually able to deal with it. And so it means that you're building a system where, for example, in an organization, a corporation, you want the product teams and the security teams to really be there fighting it out through the design and development of the system, right? And that process of truly thinking differently and challenging one another actually allows you to make trade-offs, but to make them in a way where you actually see the frictions. So this little hint for those who are sort of more from the corporate side, if you shove responsible AI off in a separate corner, that is not heterogeneous engineering. You don't do it after the fact. That's also true for security and many other spaces. So the thing about heterogeneous engineering, which is also really fascinating, is that fundamentally it's a commitment to robustness, right? That the system should be robust or resilient. But the interesting thing about building systems that are robust is that they are not necessarily going to move fast, right? Speed is often a contradiction to that robustness. And so it's about thinking about how those entanglements actually have to work it through. It doesn't mean that you have to throw away efficiency. It means that you really want to put a different priority in place. So if you're going, and you hear this from other fields often, if you're going to build a cell tower, you're going to invest however many millions of dollars in building a cell tower, you want to make certain that that is interoperable in all sorts of different dimensions, that it actually is including different kinds of things like how it will affect water sources, et cetera. So there's a process by which you think about it because you're doing this mass investment. The irony that we have in a lot of software areas is that we often are like, let's build a half-baked process and throw it out and see what happens. That is antithetical to robustness. And that means that you're not taking heterogeneous engineering point into consideration. All right, second core trap, which was next layer out, we were thinking about the portability trap, which we defined as failure to understand how repurposing algorithmic solutions designed for one social context may be misleading, inaccurate, or otherwise do harm when applied to a different context. So this is pretty much the story of AI, right? Like let's take something that was really designed for here and let's make it general, or let's make it apply over here. Nothing can possibly go wrong. And I find this to be a really challenging thing at the moment right now, where everybody has these fantasies and dreams that we're going to go to general intelligence, right? Or that we're going to solve everything as a general purpose puzzle. And I especially find that weird given what we're actually building our systems on. And having spent too much time in the underworlds in which the training data are often derived, it turns out that when you train an image generation system on, say, memes on the internet, you shouldn't be surprised to find that large number of your characters turn green and have an unhealthy tendency to put their arm up at a 45-degree angle. So the thing that's always interesting to me is, how do you generalize from these kinds of environments? Like, why is there a belief that you can generalize from meme underworld? And what does it mean to even presume that? And so it's one of the places I've been thinking about it has to do with language. And I've been learning a lot from communities that are doing natural language processing of indigenous languages. Because one of the things about language is that language is the manifestation of cultural norms and logics. There is no such thing as a general purpose language. If it was, we wouldn't have communication problems, right? Like, if we could all understand each other clearly all the time. That's not how this works. Even when we're in projects like, doing translation, the act of translation is not simply word-to-word matching. It is a cultural project. And so, like, if you think about the artistry of speaking in Japanese or Arabic, it doesn't translate to English. It's a much more, there's much more, nuance into things. So you can get the words across, but you can't get it fully there. But the reason why I bring up indigenous languages is that they have a feature, particularly those that are, polysynthetic. And so I'm thinking about Inuit and Yupik. Their feature does not stabilize the notion of a noun at all, right? Everything about how words or concepts are constructed is relational, right? And if you aren't familiar with these kinds of languages, it's so intriguing. So you get this misunderstanding that like the Inuit people have, hundreds of words for snow. The reason why is that snow is a relational concept that's not located by a noun object. This is one of the reasons why when you talk to these indigenous language scholars, they really struggle with NLP because that's how these things are designed. They don't move from one place to another. And so this is this question as we're building out these general, purpose language models and all the LLMs, what are they actually even localizing in terms of our own assumptions? Right? Most of them are going to be American English. What does that look like in terms of its own cultural sensibilities? What does it mean for these things to keep evolving? What does it mean to actually think about training on the formal speeches of things that are written down, all right? So all of these ways in which the culture is sort of gets flattened in these processes. That's great in a lot of the places I deal with. Turns out government bureaucratic documents, this is amazing, right? This is so perfect for it. But there's a lot of other cultural work that's at play in here. And so one of the other things I want to think about is like where we've already seen this unfold in existing AI systems. And one of those is search engines, which is an AI system. It's just not as cool as the latest ones. And if you search for a word like coronavirus in 2020, one of the things that's interesting is how the systems developed a relational understanding that coronavirus and COVID-19 were the same thing, and it would return both to you. And this, we think this is a good thing. And maybe you would get medical content that you didn't understand, but that's okay. But what happens when it collides cultural dynamics and cultural dimensions that we may not want to see as being collided? And so this is one of my former postdocs and collaborators, because she was really interested in how some of these collisions on search engines created really harsh, intense political fights. And for example, if you search for the term illegals, should you get content that also is referencing undocumented peoples or vice versa, right? And there's politics there. There's serious politics to choosing how to make these things relational, because we can talk about the same category of people using these two different phrases, but we have a very different political valence when we do so, right? And so how do we actually understand the way that cultural wars get represented and they don't get resolved simply by a search engine trying to put them together? All right. The third trap we were dealing with is the formalism trap, which can be described as failure to account for the full meaning of social concepts such as fairness, which can be procedural, contextual, contestable, and cannot be resolved through mathematical formalisms. So it's amazing. We published this paper 5+ years ago, and the amount of work that has been done to try to formalize a definition of fairness has not stopped. It has gone on and on and on in computer science, and it's kind of fascinating to watch because you're like, I'm not sure this will ever be resolved. Like, I know enough about philosophy to suggest that like there's been thousands of years trying to resolve this, and no one can quite figure out what's going on. We end up to this moment of like, what does it mean to make it right? Because social concepts are fundamentally messy. They're socially specific. They're nuanced, right? And so it's one of my projects is earlier work trying to deal with some of that. And one of my favorites was trying to deal with privacy. Privacy is a pain to try to sort of lock down. In a technical context, it typically refers to the ability to control the flow of information, right? I used to love, my little access controls in Unix so that I can actually think about, absolute control. And by the way, for anybody who does differential privacy, I'm going to ignore formal privacy entirely. But in the legal context, there's also sort of interesting disagreements about what privacy is, which is specifically notable in the United States because all end up leading back to a same definition that nobody can agree on going forward, which is amazing, which is the sort of classic Warren and Brandeis idea that it's the right to be let alone. And the thing is that Brandeis actually wrote extensively after they made this definition. And in his writing out what he thinks, he was really interested in how people should be afforded the freedom to do as they wish without outside interference. They shouldn't be forced to be subjected to peering eyes or amplification of their likeness. And that's a really interesting set of considerations because that is really a social definition, one that became very hard to operationalize in the law, which is why most lawyers mostly ignored it forever. So Alice Warwick, one of my colleagues, she and I spent a lot of time interviewing teenagers about their understandings of social media. And of course, privacy was a topic that came up over and over again. And what we came to actually looked a lot more like Brandeis's definition than any technical or legal definition at present. What we realized is that young people were interested in the ability to control a social situation. But what does that mean? That means it's not just about the ability to flow information, it's about understanding what's happening all around you and making sense of it and being able to project into the future with some sort of certainty about how the social situation would play out. So years ago, when Facebook was actually cool, teenagers would often, get really flipped out because they'd be like, why is Facebook reposting things from a year ago? And Facebook would be like, it was public. And the teenagers would be like, it is creepy. Like, what is up with that? And the thing is that it had violated the social situation, not the technical rules, not the legal rules. And you can see this in an everyday sense in terms of young people. They can find a sense of privacy within a very public space, right? They don't really have a choice because their parents are listening in on them all the time anyhow. But it's also important to realize that the way they do it is recognizing context. And it's something that as we become adults, we don't actually pay attention to the degrees in which surveillance becomes so normalized that you seek out privacy despite surveillance, right? Which is one of the things activists understand fully. So one of the things that's happening about the debate around training AI is through the language of intellectual property, right? Who gets to own content? And this, of course, is a legal frame, but you can start to see why this is starting to reach a social and political problem. And my favorite is to look at what's been happening in Stack Overflow, which is sort of a phenomenal community for software developers, because when they're sharing their content was made available to all these AI systems, they were like, "What the heck?" Right? Like, I didn't do this to sort of train these AIs. I did it to give back to a community, to build community. And the programmers in that environment sort of rebelled, right? They were just like, this is not what I wanted it to be used for. And that felt like a harm, right? A harm that couldn't easily be explained through intellectual property, a harm that was experienced socially and culturally, about a total disconnect about what the social situation was and the expectations. And so one of the things that I keep thinking back to when I think about this has to do with a notion of gifting. So for those who are not familiar with Marcel Mauss's sort of famous anthropological text, he was sort of interested in what it means to offer a gift to somebody. And the idea was that it's not an altruistic act. If I give you a gift in some way of my time, a physical object, etc., I am creating a social expectation that you will offer something in return. Right? And it is in that exchange, that social exchange, that is not about money, but is about building relationships, building the social fabric with which we live. The programmers in Stack Overflow were not giving the gift of their time because they were just whatevs. They were giving the gift of their time to build social relationships. They didn't need clout. They didn't need formalisms. They needed a feeling as though they were part of a circular economy, if you will, right? And in that process, that community got built. And it didn't take much to just tear it all apart. And intellectual property or not, the rupture is real. All right, next kind of trap, ripple effects. This is the failure to understand how the insertion of technology into an existing social system changes the behaviors and embedded values of the pre-existing system. So, of course, this is one of those moments where we're starting to see not just the real effects of AI, but the rhetorical effects of AI. Right? It doesn't matter whether the systems actually work. The idea that AI is coming is so much triggering these ripple effects where large universities decide they're going to create all new systems to deal with AI. Students feel like they have to study AI in every way. These are these ripple effects of marketing. But there's something amazingly arrogant about doing a technical mic drop and then expecting everybody else to have to cope with whatever comes your way, right? And in many ways, that is the ripple effect that we are right now dealing with in AI, right? Which is to say that we don't know all sorts of ways in which these technologies are going to change ecosystems, but we're going to create a mass disruption. Hope somebody can figure it out. right? And who's going to actually pay the costs for that? And so this is where I keep coming back to one of my favorite sociological theories, which is normal accidents theory. Out of curiosity, how many of you are familiar with normal accidents theory? Oh, all the more fun. Okay, so Charles Perrow was a sociologist, and he wanted to understand what went down at 3 Mile Island, right, which was a near nuclear catastrophe. Everybody was saying, oh my gosh, the people did something wrong. They didn't pay attention to the signals. And some of the things we know for certain is that like there were some ripple effects within the system, the technical system. Beeping was going off everywhere, right? The humans were trying to respond to the beeping. The humans ended up responding to the beeping in ways that made things worse, and all went to near hell. And thankfully not total hell, which is how we're going to reopen 3 Mile Island. And so one of the things he argued in this process is that when you're looking at these organizational, these complex sociotechnical systems, you need to account for how complex the system is and how tightly coupled the component pieces are, right? Which is that if one is dependent on the other, is dependent on the other. So it's not just a human factors question. It is about these sort of sociotechnical coupling. And that the more complex and more tightly coupled a system is going to be, the more likely it will have a normal accident. That not just that the idea that it is inevitable, but the idea that it is configured with an arrangement that makes it probabilistically more likely. And then he, of course, one of the things that was beautiful about his work is he sort of said, there's ways of resisting this, right? There's ways of resisting an inevitability, there's ways of reducing the probabilistic outcome of badness. And a lot of it for him was about thinking about resilience. What do we mean to think about redundancy? What does it mean to think about the various backstops and buffers? What does it mean to build into those systems ways of better managing it? And this is a sort of fascinating dynamic, and I can give you lots of amazing stories of what's been built off of this literature since the 70s. But one of the things that's so fascinating to watch in terms of the contemporary environment is that this obsession with efficiency or disruption at all costs is antithetical to the ways of responding to a complex, tightly coupled environment, right? Which is to say that we are dropping a set of AI systems into an environment without accounting for all of these kinds of organizational arrangements in ways that are going to create fragility, going to create brittleness. And so what does it mean to bring resiliency back into those systems in order to not prevent whatever catastrophe we might see around the corner? So our final trap in all of this was the solutionism trap. And I really, really, really wanted to call this the submarine trap, which I thought was really funny because it was the time when Elon Musk thought that submarines would solve all problems. My collaborators told me that this was not appropriate. I still think it's a better name. But this is the failure to recognize the possibility that the best solution to a problem may not involve technology at all, right? And so when I think about that submarine solution to the Thai soccer team, you're like, are you out of your mind? You know nothing about what's going on here. And it was very much a coordination of a human activity that rescued those children, right? One that was about practice and really about building team structures, et cetera, because they encountered all sorts of things that they couldn't. And so, on my flight out here, I watched Don't Look Up, and I was like, oh, that sounds awfully familiar. So if anybody hasn't seen it, it's really fun. So the thing is that AI is not going to fix, everything in the kitchen sink. And I'm actually a big fan of very specific AI uses. I think they're really phenomenal. What's going on in science is just like making my, mind blown in the best possible ways. But it's not the same as like we're going to, invest so that we can try to advance our discovery and explore. Is very different than we will solve climate change. Right? That is a very different set of commitment. We will explore and try to figure it out. It's different than we will solve cancer, right? And so this moment that we're going and saying we're going to have a solution, it is a form of hubris that actually I think is going to be really costly in this ecosystem. And it's important for us to keep in mind that it's not as simple as when we look at it, I'm like, okay, AI is not going to fix racism. AI is not going to fix our geopolitics. AI is not going to fix da, 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 da. And that's the critical move, right? But there's a bigger move of going like, it's also going to cause that. And I'll come back to this in a second. So one of the things I invite everybody in this room to actively do, get rid of the word solutionism or for a solution from your vocabulary entirely. Think about it every time you want to say that. I have a solution to that. Stop, just stop. Some things are not complex or tightly coupled. Getting a key to open the door, the key is the solution. But when we're dealing with complex systems, solution is a very, very dangerous word, right? And when we think about responsible AI, we also don't have solutions to it. And that's where I want us to sort of recognize this. Instead, I recommend taking from public health and from other spaces and use the word intervention. You are building a piece of technology that is intervening in the world, and it is going to have all sorts of effects that you can evaluate and you can assess. Because the beauty of the word intervention is that it is an invitation for evaluation, right? It is not the solution, because a solution suggests that like you never have to look at it again. An intervention says we have to see what played out. And that's a really important twist to it all. All right. So I sort of paused myself because I sort of came into this place where I started to realize that solutionism was not just the language that is happening within the tech industry. I grew up in the tech industry with everybody solutioning to everything. But what I started to realize is that this rhetoric has worked its way into policy discourse and public discourse. So much so that we are seeing policymakers demand solutions to problems without understanding what the intervention should be. And the place that I was struggling with this has to do with a particular set of bills called the Kids Online Safety Act, now the Kids Online Safety and Privacy Act. And Maria Angel and I were sort of staring down all of these bills. We're trying to make sense of what they mean, and they have many components to them. But in particular, we became fascinated with a set of things around duty of care. And the duty of care provisions, in effect, say, dear tech companies, you must design to stop mental duress. I don't know about you, but the news gives me mental duress. So what the heck does that mean? Dear tech companies, you must design to stop bullying. You must design to solve social problems. And so we talked about this as techno-legal solutionism, which is the idea that the law became so embraced of solutionistic rhetoric that it is demanding the solution. It is demanding that you will solve these problems and expecting the tech companies to be able to do that. And that is a really weird turn. And so you might actually have a sort of but, because seatbelts are the ones that everybody likes to but. But there's something very fascinating about seatbelts. By the time that the law mandated that all car companies must implement seatbelts, they had already had amazing data that seatbelts were a good intervention to address death, in a car. So the requirement was not companies, you must solve stopping people from dying in cars. The intervention was we have, or the policymaking was we have an intervention that we know improves the odds. So do that. And that is a very different equation here, because what we're seeing right now is that policymakers in the tech place aren't going, we know that you having all the data forever is causing problems, so we're going to crawl back that data. That's not what they're saying. Those bills failed in this country. Instead, they're going, you have to solve these social problems. So that's some of the things that are playing out. I want to be clear, because I did a lot of work about young people, and people hear me say this and are just like, oh, you're just letting Facebook off the hook. And I'm like, no. There's many things that the tech companies actually have control over that they can make a serious difference in. But I think that when we make bills that are about this techno-legal solutionism, we miss those opportunities. And a lot of those have to do with ways of intervening, at the economic place, right? You can actually control advertising. You can say companies can or can't do X on advertising. That is something fully in their control. They have the ability to do this, right? You can tax them. Have a field day. You want to compare this to cigarettes? Tax the heck out of it. It wasn't the ugly pictures that did a difference. It was the taxation. So tax them, fine. So all of these other interventions that actually can be in control or actually affect them are a different category. But we think we're trying to solve things when we're doing these design interventions by law that are actually more damaging long-term than other things that would actually make a difference. All right, back to AI. So those were some of the 5 traps, a little bit translated, but I want to give you sort of 3 more traps that we were playing with in all of this, because it's not just tech designers in this AI conversation who are getting enrolled in all of these different traps. It is also policymakers, it is also business people and marketers and academics at this point. So as Brian foretold, the first one here, it has to do with the invisibility or the inevitability trap, which is the failure to recognize that the future is not preordained. So I pointed out about solutionism, but there's actually a concept within solutionism that you have to understand is part of a bunch of different kinds of assumptions, and it's deterministic thinking. Deterministic thinking is if X, then Y, right? If I add a submarine, then I will solve the problem with children, right? Like it being trapped. So if X, then Y allows us to then jump to the solutionistic thinking of like, well, then Y because X, right? So this is sort of the dangerous element of it all. But the inevitability trap that we get into has a lot more leeway to it, where it's like, okay, because we get in deterministic thinking so rooted in so many conversations about technology, we are doing not just solutionism, but we're doing all sorts of, fear mongering. So this is where I'm like, if AI, it doesn't mean that it will solve cancer, but it also doesn't mean it will destroy democracy, right? And it's important to recognize that that deterministic thinking is just as commonplace in policymaking and in public discourse as it is in tech discourse. They just go in opposite directions, right? And the fact that they have a Y prime from this doesn't make it any more or less deterministic. So, I foretold myself. So this is one of the things, in thinking about those deterministic elements, we have to sort of resist that mindset and resist that through critical thinking as well. So the thing that's important to me is also when we have to recognize how to identify deterministic thinking. Where is it happening in our world? It's happening in our academic world all the time. So it's just like, this is that moment of calling it out when you're doing it in class of like, this is, going to happen. These kinds of moments of like, this is a terrible thing. We don't know. Those are empirical questions. And those empirical questions are important because the thing about those empirical questions is that we can do interventions in them. Interventions to inevitability change the equation, right? They allow us to add friction or to make certain futures easier to happen. That's the beauty of an intervention. So this is not about resisting interventions. This is about resisting the idea that your intervention will inevitably lead to a particular outcome. And that's one of the reasons why we can't go around being like, we're going to solve the AI problem with regulation. It's like, oh my gosh, please stop. And that kind of arrangement, that sociotechnical arrangement to me is the most important part. And the other thing to keep in mind is how much that inevitability rhetoric is manufactured by the media and by marketing parts of firms, right? There is a lot to get to be a benefit from that inevitability rhetoric. So we'll come back to some of that. Second sort of new trap has to do with the disruption trap, right? Which is the failure to account for and address the true costs of valorizing disruption. So this trap is built on the ripple effect trap, but it's an important sort of tweak to it all. Because the disruption trap is sort of a commitment to how disruption is inherently good, which is really common within the tech environments. And I have to admit that I groan whenever I hear about how generative AI is going to disrupt X, Y, Z. Because it's that combination of disruption as valorized and inevitability as there. Will there be disruptions in the future? Yes, there always are, right? Putting a new person into an organization is a disruption. So let's acknowledge that disruptions occur and they will happen with or without AI. But the thing about those disruptions as they play out is that they're more complicated than we often imagine. And the way we tell the historical understandings of disruptions is often mired in a lot of problematic elements. So like my favorite example here, there's been a lot written on it, has to do with the Luddites, right? Which is that the Luddites were understood historically or now rhetorically as machine breakers. But what they were arguing about had nothing to do with the technology. What they were arguing about had to do with a shift in economic arrangements that came alongside the technology that really forced a political sort of land grab that looks a lot like late stage capitalism. And the result is they were rising up, not against the technology, but around this entire economic arrangement. And they destroyed the machines, not because they hated the machines, but because they wanted to challenge the status quo. Unfortunately, they were hung. And so we often go back and tell the story of them either as valorized like rebels or as people that were sort of haters of technology, and both sort of miss the complex picture of what was going on at the time. So the other place where it's really helpful to analytically think about this disruption I come back to is Manuel Castells. And so he's a sociologist. And one of the things he talked about, he wrote this beautiful book, Communication Power, where he's interested in the kinds of power that exist within networks. And like, as any irritatingly lovable European scholar writing in English does, he labeled his things in the most frustrating way. So he calls it network power, networked power, networking power, and network making power. And trying to remember that is a pain. But it's the important meta story of that analysis is that there's power that exists within networks. You can learn to identify the power that operates in networks, the relationships, the structures, where you can fit within an organization, for example. You can build those new relationships. This is what we call networking, right, for professional purposes. But the real power is situated in those who can create the conditions for the network as a whole. And I point this out because one of the key things about understanding disruption, especially disruption that comes from the tech industry or any institution with a tremendous amount of money and power, is that they are throwing down the disruption to rearrange the networks because it's a land grab that they can then capitalize on. And that is a lot of the story of what we've been dealing with in AI. It's also where it comes to the speed trap, which is the failure to acknowledge and protect society from unintended consequences of moving too fast. Right? We all know the faster, faster, faster story, which is connected to the inevitability. Well, one of the things that I love in thinking about this is where my heart goes back to STS. So there's a concept of interpretive flexibility in STS, right? It's core to the social construction of technology literature, Scott's literature. And the basic idea is that a technology as it's being developed can be interpreted in many different ways, right? It has many different possible futures. The classic example here is about a bicycle. Turns out that bicycles, as we now know it, were not always two-wheeled. They were not the same size wheels. There was a lot of different interpretive flexibility of what this thing that we now call a bicycle should look like. And it was a process to go from all sorts of imagined inventions to a standardized process. And that standardized process was really important because in the process of standardization, you could make these things cheaper. You could build them en masse. You could build infrastructure around them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's this process by which an invention occurs. It is massively flexible in its interpretation, and you go through the standardization process, usually referred to as closure. Well, the really important thing to understand here is that businesses who are well poised in that network structure to capitalize on something, disrupt, and then they try to create closure around their innovation as fast as possible. Because when they create closure around that innovation, they get to actually yield the benefits. And if you care about critical ways, if you want to challenge how these arrangements are set up, if you see and recognize the inequities that are part of the system, the work to be done is to keep them as flexible in interpretation as possible. Okay? That is the act of resistance in this context. Okay, so as we look to this, one of the things I want to flag before I go into some of the interventions has to do with how we start to see moments where broader social, political, and economic arrangements sort of get caught up. And I want to flag for a moment this amazing work by Madeline Ellish, which is about moral crumple zones. So for those who don't know what a crumple zone is, it's the part of the car that absorbs pain on impact, right? And what she was doing is she was studying the history of aviation and understanding how autopilot, hint AI, came into being many decades ago, right? And what she discovered was that the Federal Aviation Administration was having all these debates about what should happen there. And in those debates, they were like, oh, well, I think we got 3 people in the cockpit. We've got a pilot, a co-pilot, and a navigator. We can kick that navigator out by now, right? But should autopilot be allowed to fly a plane without a pilot or co-pilot? That was the question at play in the 70s. Because we all knew by then that autopilot was more effective. But the thing that's so fascinating about this is that they agreed, FAA decided we're going to keep the pilot and co-pilot in. Congress sort of put this forward. But those pilot and co-pilot became systematically de-skilled on the job. They don't fly planes anymore. They babysit machines. They are underpaid, overworked, in a position that's very, very precarious. And so you end up with these things where they become humans in the loop to step in and fix when a machine goes to hell, but they're in the worst possible position to do so. And because they're the last ones touching the controls when the plane crashes, it's always human error, even though it's a sociotechnical arrangement. And so this is about avoiding those kinds of arrangements, learning to see them and avoiding them, because the pain is not at first. The pain is felt 40 years later when you have a large company who decides that it doesn't need to invest as much in building safe planes so that you can maybe lose, part of the wall. So this is where it's like looking at these kinds of arrangements as their long-term elements. All right, so what can we do that's constructive here? So we went beyond a lot of these traps in designing it. We started thinking about what are some of the actions that were possible. And so I'm going to give you a couple of them that I think were really constructive in related AI. The first has to do with sociotechnical security. So many people have heard red teaming. The term, of course, comes from the security, and what it means is all over the place. As an intervention, red teaming's efficacy has been extraordinarily variable, right? And part of it is that it was created and labeled red teaming as a way to give it status and legitimacy within the tech industry because it has security language. But it misses a lot of the security mindset that I think is really important, which is why I want to ratchet it up and talk about sociotechnical security. Because sociotechnical security is really coming from a field where they know that they're in a Sisyphean task. There is no such thing as a secure system, right? It's like the conversation. There's no such thing as safe sex. There is safer sex. There are safer security systems. There is no thing as this ultimate element. Instead, what you're trying to identify are different kinds of moves that you can make to make it more secure, not ultimately secure. And when you take that mindset and you bring in that Sisyphean mindset to this, you start to realize that it's about creating the conditions as an ecosystem to be able to see and respond and have the flexibility and extensibility of the systems to be able to manage that. That's what sociotechnical security looks like. It's looking out and seeing how these systems are evolving. But of course, one of the things that's important about all of this is that when you do this, when you build this whole system, it costs money and it is low status because you're only recognizing your security person the moment that everything goes wrong, right? This is a very terrible arrangement, but it is also one that you can do a lot of interventions. So one of the reasons why we started doing financial auditing, right? We do these kinds of broader systems because in order to do sociotechnical security, you have to go beyond the security of a specific technical system into a broader element. And so if you want to see how this plays out, I have been on a little bit of an aviation kick lately. So if you want to sort of see where this plays out, there's another great book called Rational Accidents by John Downer, where he looks at what it takes to test airplanes, because it's like testing is a really fascinating part of this whole equation. And we've lost that. Like I grew up in engineering where we had a quality assurance engineer. As a developer, when I worked at Macromedia, I sat side by side with my QA. I coded all day. She spent the next day destroying my code, back and forth and back and forth. It was a beautiful arrangement. Also, her name was Raven Erebus, which great. But the thing is how do you test these complex systems without having the public be your QA? And so this is a place where you can actually start to see it. As aviation's a place that turns out they don't just throw planes in the sky and see if they fly. And I'm particularly fond of the fact that they have to throw chickens into the propellers, which I was like, oh my gosh, like I mean, they're dead chickens, and I guess we eat chickens, but whew. Okay, another real component here has to do with maintenance and repair. So when Lee Vinsel and Andy Russell published The Innovation Delusion, there was like an ode to those who maintain systems, because this is like another world where we don't pay attention until things go wrong. And I heart the maintenance people. And they flag a lot of industries, how industries become so obsessed with innovation that they don't think about the maintenance of it. And this is really important. And for those of us who are old school internet people, otherwise just known as old, one of the things that's been heartbreaking lately is to watch how much internet infrastructure is collapsing all around us. Web pages going down, hearts out to Brewster Kahle, his efforts to keep the archive of the internet alive. But it is really notable how much of that old infrastructure. I should have had the beautiful XKCD moment where it's like, all things hinge on the open source code right here. But I say this because I think it's really important that when we're building a lot of these AI stuff, these things will degrade. They will fall apart. And how do we build maintenance and repair into them from the beginning? Because if we look at them trying to be successful or useful, when they become infrastructural, They need to have that kind of rigor into them, or we can't build on top of them, right? It's like building on top of quicksand. And so this is one of the things I always find fascinating when people are like, well, why aren't you integrating AI into your latest system? And I'm like, is it going to be updated in the next hour or the hour after that? It's like, I'll wait until this settles, right? And a lot of that is because maintenance and repair have to be part of the system build. And we're not actually thinking in those terms. We haven't learned this lesson. We are living with massive amounts of tech debt, and we haven't learned how this is just growing and growing and growing. Other industries have learned it, which is important to look at. Finally, resilience, resilience, resilience. It's one of the things when I think about this idea of the perpetual beta of Web 2.0, which was like a thing. We'll just keep the, showing up in fail whales and hoping that all will go well. We really didn't think about resilience, and the entire industry lost the ability to build resilient code. They figured they could fix it. And there's a night and day world. Like, I love talking to my friends who work at NASA because they're like, are you guys out of your mind over there? It's like, when we throw $1 billion, piece of equipment up on the back of a rocket, right? Like, we don't get to just hope it will work out, right? It's a very different mindset when you're throwing something to go off to Mars. Well, what would it mean for us to treat AI as going off to Mars effectively? What would it mean to build the kinds of thinking that build resilience in at every level, right? And that's part of what's important for me, because if we keep living in a perpetual beta environment, we are going to create conditions where there's not just arbitrage, and there's a lot of arbitrage going on, but we're going to create the conditions where there's all sorts of ripple effects in the worst possible ways. And this can be resolved through a lot of different kinds of resilience. That means economic resilience. That means actually paying for the costs of what AI costs rather than punching it down to our children. That means actually building in systems that make certain that there are checks and balances to it. And that's why I say fundamentally responsible AI is not a thing that you're just going to achieve. It is a mindset. It is a mindset to keep working at and to keep asking critically if not just the technology is working, but the arrangement as a whole is going to be a way as we as a society want to live with. And with that, thank you so much. All right, Q&A. So you see my cat. That's pretty adorable. I don't know how we see the people. All right, we'll see my cat. We'll leave her there. Questions? Come on. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. From the start, I had a question. Like, you talked about norms, but
The mic is being drawn to you.
thank you.
Apparently, I scream loud enough.
Thank you. Okay. You were talking about norms, and throughout the presentation, I kept thinking, like, what if people, like the people who are creating the technology disagree with your norms? Is what you're trying to do, like convincing the new generations to care about this? Or how can we convince people who disagree with us, I guess, about our norms?
So norms are going to be contested no matter what. The question is at what scale, in what dynamic, and how do you allow that contestation to play out in a constructive rather than destructive way, right? Which is to say, the 20th century project is one of creating nation states. That is fundamentally a norm project, right? Within these ideas and resolving it through the UN, which is not. But these moments of like every organization comes with its own set of norms, its own set of cultures. And this is to me one of the costly things of our obsession with scale. If we keep doing things and think that every answer to this is about scale, we miss the whole point, because we are going to have different kinds of norms. We're going to have different kinds of values. And the question is, how do you start building checks and balances to that? How do you start actually building political power to say, like, you know what, these norms, like, it's like, yes, we created a nation state where we decided that killing was bad. I'm glad about this, right? Like, that's fantastic. But how do we start thinking about that more holistically? As a political project, there's not a really easy answer for you, right? Like, that is a story and theories of change all up. I think that the things that I am sort of invested in is like, how do we stop allowing, we basically in the 1980s, when we deregulated the finance industry, we created the conditions for the tech industry to be out of control through scale, right? And think about it, like, if you're Facebook, Meta, you're Meta, you renamed yourself. If you're Meta, you have to find more users. How? You have to diversify your P&L. They might succeed at that, maybe, profit and loss, economic plans. Or you have to do more and more sketchy shit, right? Those are your three options to keep that stock price going up. And you've acquired all your engineers based on the idea that they're going to be paid in salary some, but their real promise is that stock price. That is a terrible arrangement, right? And the question for me is how far this is going to have to go within the industry until it bursts in the US, and what's that going to look like to reimagine how we've done the financial arrangements. So for me, there's a check to the systems, and then there's a check to the financial arrangements that make certain systems become more probabilistically likely to grow toxic. And right now, with that economic configuration, every company that starts out and is like, I'm going to do good in the world, they manage that for a while, but they cannot like grow infinitely. And the harder their hockey curve is, the faster they reach that really toxic place. And so this is one of those things that I think we have to be asking our questions, not about the specific companies, but about the economic arrangements that make those companies make a set of decisions that I think are going to continue to lead us onto really problematic class. And it's one of the things that's really hard, like, you know, living within this tech environment. And I want to be clear, we're at a university. I don't know anything about your endowment, but I'm sure you have one. And if you think about what that endowment is, right, that is dependent on that stock market going up and up and up. So it's not just the corporations that are invested in this, it is the entire environment, right? So you don't get to escape it by like, I'm gonna be in academia and I get to avoid it. It's like, no, right? And the difference in academia is we like to just pretend like it's over there. That's what those, you know, endowment people do, but it's all part of it. So for me, your question about those norms is the question about how do we get political power to change this broader arrangement so that we can develop sustainable systems that won't always go off in these directions because of the way we structure our finance. I know it's really optimistic. I'm trying, you know. Hey, I'm gonna give you the mic too, please.
Oh, hi.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks a lot. What a great talk. My name is David O'Donnell and I'm here as a teacher with some students from high school. And I'm familiar with the work of like Cal Newport and Patrick Winston. And I wondered if you could comment on how pernicious is social media or the cell phone and what it's doing to teenagers today. That there's a report on Monday's New York Times front page about the problem of loneliness in society and a study of 500 teenagers this summer. If you just comment on that, I appreciate it.
So I'm going to push back on you on what are they doing to kids? What conditions have we created where young people are turning to these tools because they have agency for all sorts of different reasons? And it's important to put that into place because the thing is that we've created really bad choices as a society for a long time. And let's have a little bit of fun. We'll go back to the 1920s, which is sort of this favorite moment to me because from the 1880s, 1890s on, by the way, the term adolescence was created in 1890 as a political project in order to mark younger people as different because moral reformers were concerned that their souls would be harmed if they were, you know, if they were not treated separately. So the goal of treating them separately started with a moral reformer. Then it moved on in the 1920s with labor unions because they were concerned that 16-year-olds were going to be able to have be more successful at work than the 40-year-olds. And so the idea was to get them the heck out of the workplace. Welcome to compulsory high school. So if you ever thought school was meant to be a jail, it was actually designed to go on. So I set this in motion because what it also did for us is by the late 1940s and 1950s in the US, we decided as a country that all of these men coming home from the war needed jobs that had been filled by women and by teenagers. And this was a huge problem. So welcome to a backlash around women that was really lovely, but also the creation, not just of return to compulsory high school for teenagers, but age segregation, very explicitly making it so that young people couldn't interact with adults. And how did they do that? Sports. Welcome to high school sports, right? The reason we created high school sports was that the labor unions ran the sporting infrastructure up until the 40s. So I say all of this because we have created such shitty conditions for young people at this point, where we're saying like, yeah, good luck. We're gonna like trap you in a bubble. And then when you magically turn at a certain age, you're gonna just go off and be able to do all these things on your own. And by the way, don't pay attention to politics, don't pay attention to anything until you can magically vote. Like, this is nuts. And so I say this because when I was doing my work with teenagers, a decade ago, we'd already been seeing the restrictions on young people's access to public life, right? And my favorite was this amazing New Orleans study in the early 1980s, where they were like, oh my gosh, kids, they're destroying the town. And so the answer to this was to create massive curfews. And it did nothing. It did nothing to address the violence issues in New Orleans. And the mayor then is asked, like, well, so, are you gonna roll back and let teenagers out? Nah, life is better without teenagers on the streets. But we have pulled young people out of public life. Young people are looking for public life. They have gone to social media, to different things, to have access to a public life when they have been constricted for so long. Meanwhile, we actually have another big mental health problem. Like, I am obsessed right now over young people's lack of access to non-custodial adults. So this includes coaches and mentors and aunties and pastors and neighbors, right? Because these are important infrastructure. We think that we can solve everything as parents, where parents are the only adult relationship and teachers at a distance, and the coaches that are pressuring you nonstop to not just like have fun playing soccer, but like be the best. This is a toxic combination. So when you have it then, and young people are like, social media, TikTok, let me stare at cats, aren't cats cute? Like, there's a form of entertainment that's a relaxation mode, which frankly is the same as my like MTV problem when I was young. And then you have the sociality outlet where like, you're like, I want to talk to my friends. And by the time I get done doing my 5 hours of homework at night, of course it's 10 o'clock when I'm finally able to talk to my friends. Like, but I haven't been able to talk to them all day. And so this is where it's like, we can't just look at the technology. We have to look at this bigger picture. The other thing that I always find entertaining, I'm going to speak to the adults in the room rather than the kids, which is that we adults suck. Like, we are not good at actually checking our own shit with technology. And then we complain about teenagers, right? Like, you walk into any room of teenagers and you ask them what their biggest problems with their parents are, they're like, my mom won't get off the phone, right? Like, they complain about us all the time. And I say this because like one of the things we can do as adults is be really thoughtful of our own actions from the time our kids are tiny. And so one of the things I say for parents of, for example, little ones, is that every time you pick up that device in their presence, verbalize what you're doing on it. Because the thing is you're gonna be like, I am picking up this device to call your other parent. I am picking up this device to order food. You're not gonna be like, I am picking up this device to doom scroll because I'm really tired of playing school again, right? And so these moments of being able to be recognizing what we do and what we have norms set. And I say this because in some ways we're going down the path in the United States that we went down with alcohol. And I'm sure this university is struggling with that to this day, where suddenly when you're 21, you're gonna have your first drink, right? Whereas you look to other places that socialize and have harder conversations, and it's a process. You don't start out being on your own on a college campus at 18, illegally drinking, whatever hard liquor you've managed to get your hands on. So this is where it's like, for me, the story of young people and technology is a story of socialization, of process, of thoughtfulness. And it starts with us as adults really showing what values we want in our own household regarding technology. And if we can't do that, why do we expect teenagers to be better than we are? Yeah, behind you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. So yes, I share some of your frustrations with COSA, and I was curious if you were not president for a day, but if you were emperor for a day and had infinite power over the US.
Authoritarianism.
Yes. If you had infinite power to write a regulation that you think would address all of these concerns we have right now with the impacts of technology, what would your absolutely ideal bill or law look like?
It would fundamentally be about regulating the venture capital industry. Like, for me, it's really about going up the scaffold. I don't think that you can do anything at that level And I think that the efforts at that level are, lipstick on a pig, like changing the chairs on the Titanic, right? Like those kinds of metaphors. And I think that's what I find hardest about this, right? Which is that I know so many idealists who have gone into the industry being like, we're going to make this work. And then you create these conditions and you watch these sets of trade-offs and you watch these, elements. And, you're ousted as a CEO, like, the thing that people forget about CEOs, you report to a board. And even before that company is public, that board can hire and fire you, and often when you're crazy, right? Like there's some really great examples of this. They don't always fire you. It's a matter of whether you're useful. You're paying attention to the companies. The CEO is not the most important person. The CFO is. So it's like drag the CFOs into Congress and have them testify about the trade-offs because they determine headcount. They determine what the priorities are at every level. And so this is one of those things where, for me, I keep going back, and it's probably time to reread it this week. I love Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. And so for those who have never read Eichmann in Jerusalem, Hannah Arendt was a European Jewish woman who came to the US to escape the Nazis. And she begged and pleaded to be able to go to the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem, title. Because she wanted to understand how this man who was at the center of the architect of the concentration camps could have made these decisions. And the book, it still, puts, goosebumps on me because what the book does is it walks you into the everyday logic of how everything seems rational. And you can sit there and you're following along. You're like, I can see how that's done. I can see that decision. And then like every 30 pages, she slaps you upside the head and is like, this is the Nazis, right? And it's this reminder that this is not about a bunch of bad people. This is a bad arrangement. And that arrangement to me is a financial arrangement. Now, do I know enough about financial policy to tell you how to not tank the economy while doing it? No. But I know that that is the right level that we need to be working at. And that if we work at these lower levels, we're just going to be moving things around. Now, there's other things that I'd like to see. Like one of the things I'm working on right now is I'm working with some collaborators who are trying to build out the infrastructure on what we would normally call trust and safety. And so it involves a lot of different technologies. For those who haven't dealt with CSAM, commercial sexual abuse images of minors, or all of these other sort of really hardcore toxic things, there's technologies that can be done, and there's organizational policies. And one of the things that drives us all bonkers is that it's like every new company has to reinvent the wheel. Like when we watched the character.ai, death by suicide, which is horrific. And we can talk about loneliness. We can talk about somebody who is feeling isolated. We can talk about all these things now. The fact that that thing did not have scaffolding around it when suicide comes up, that did not send red flags in every which direction, we have learned that over and over again. That doesn't need to be relearned, right? And so those are building some of those tools. And personally, I would like to see the condition where it's like venture capitalists are held liable as board members of companies if they do not ensure TNS before launch, right? So there's things like that that can actually, for lessons learned, things like, at this point, we do not need another photo sharing service that doesn't need to learn, that needs to learn not to allow CSAM to be spread. Like, really? Why? This is too many decades in for this to be funny. But that to me is like, if we do it company after company, we're going to fail. If we do it VC, that's where economic incentives get interesting, right? And that's where there's actually money to hold them accountable. So for me, it's like a lot of it is twisting it back at that level. Either when we're talking public companies, then we're talking, the street and the ways that, you can expel that kind of regulation, or private equity, hedge funds, and VC as the other component.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So back when you talked about Stack Overflow, I remember I heard many opinions that AI should be made like open source and sort of public good. Do you think it will help with responsible use of it? And like, do you agree with it? And if you do, like, what steps should we take as a society to achieve it?
So there's many things for me that's like sort of in AI. So I'm going to bank it to the generative AI that people are sort of obsessing over in large language models. The reason why I think that there's a lot of value for doing things in a public way is that you can actually do a lot more collective evaluation and tasking and do all sorts of other things collectively. The reason why they're not going to do it is that there's a lot of precarious stuff about which the stuff has been trained that I think we need to ask some really hard questions about, right? And one of the things you talk to the government on is like, they would never allow such systems that were trained without some form of consent, right? And so that becomes a non-starter on these current systems. And so there's like all of these justifications, but at the end of the day, it has to do with these things were not ethically sourced to begin with. So how do we actually back up and build an appropriate system? The challenge is that to do that and build it under those terms at this point is going to be extremely hard, right? And so what you're seeing is that the companies are going to go as far as possible with the abuse of things to the point where they become too big to fail, right? We are in that mode right now. And I am very curious. I actually think that the more interesting places where we're going to see an alternate path forward are non-English. I specifically look to a lot of European countries because they have a lot of incentive to do things within a language that is non-English, and they have the economic capital. So like I'm looking at things like Denmark right now, right? Whereas it's like Danish is a different styled language, but they have a very different kind of model around governance and everything else. So I think we're going to see alternate models. I wouldn't be surprised if we also see there's a lot going on in Japan right now as well. But it's going to be a different kind of equation that's going to be less of a public infrastructure equation and more of a different combination. So I'm looking to these different models because I think that in the US and in English, we're in a much messier place. And I don't know how to unroll this as well. I also don't, I mean, there's so, I mean, this is one of the things you have to laugh with. Why is Meta making it publicly available? Because they want to undermine their competitors, right? Like that's the only reason. So that this is where you're dealing with so few ridiculously overly, sized companies playing games with one another, constantly undermining each other, constantly messing with each other's business models, so they can, they bear the cost in a distributive way. That's monopoly, right? And that's where it's, I don't think over the next 4 years, we're going to see any check to that. Because it's going to be, in the Department of Government Efficiency. It's going to have fields about that. So I don't see it moving in the US, but I do see it moving elsewhere. And so I'm going to look elsewhere for models of what comes up. And I think it'll be interesting. I also think the other reason why Denmark is just fascinating to me, to be clear, is because the majority of their economy is really connected to pharma. It's a huge part of it. And there's very different kinds of AI development when you're thinking about prioritizing a single sector like that than when you're thinking about AGI, right? And so I think that the loose cannon US AGI element is just not going to be what the majority of the world does. And so I'm looking even for LLMs. So I'm very curious what it's going to start looking like in other places. But the American people are the test subjects of this crazy adventure. Maybe it's better than syphilis. I don't know.
Thanks so much.
Others. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Sarah. So my question is about the trade-off between accuracy and, as you mentioned, other concerns, because when we feed more data, it becomes more accurate and more like aware of our preferences. Even if when we are chatting with ChatGPT, it asks about our preferences. When we give response, it like memorizes them, kind of arranges itself according to them. So how do we know it? Because people like it better when the AI model is more specialized to them, like a friend, like a personal assistant. So they wouldn't want it to be like more kind of general because of less data points or so. Like how can we find a good sweet point here?
So again, we're dealing with AGI versus specialized, stuff. And the thing is that I think it's notable and very specific to our political economy that we decided to launch with AGI-oriented things first for the general public to try out and not pay the costs for, rather than going to specialized spaces first, right? Like that says a lot about where we are politically in terms of our economy. The reality is that these systems, the general purpose, like ChatGPT systems, they create an illusion for the average person that this is sort of working. But you'll see when people play too long at this, they're like, well, that got really boring really fast, right? And it's just like, I always love watching students use it for class papers. It's just like, congratulations, you got a B, because it turns out that these systems get really boring and really consistent. And they're really trained to be mediocre. And the fact that they are mediocre and being good enough is good enough for many specific situations. But we are not prioritizing this. So, earlier today I was asked about, government. And one of the things, government is about like rules of standards like nothing else, right? Like every document under this format in this way and this, element. And yet these tools, because they have not become consistent, are unusable, right? Because they're not designed to make certain that they actually abide by these rule sets. And so the thing about everyday vernacular speech is that it doesn't have to abide by the rule sets. I can speak to you using different language than he can, and that's fine. And that's great, but like, again, for what use case in the long term. So I am really interested in seeing these as use specific and specific over time in particular ways. Now, I want to flag a component of it because one of the things that's coming up a lot has to do with the way in which they work as therapy. And I think it's a really interesting space of what's going on here. As someone who's worked in doing mental health counseling for a very long time. Because the reality is that most people, when they're seeking sort of information, they want to actually process in their own heads, and they need something to bounce off of. And the reality is that like you can do that with your dog half the time, right? Like where you're like, I'm trying to verbalize out loud, you are just doing nothing except letting me pet, and somehow that works, right? Welcome to therapy, dogs. But this is also where like some of these AIs, just by simply giving you the feedback, are very effective at doing this. But the question is, what are you actually fundamentally seeking? Are you seeking the ability to process verbally, which is a totally reasonable thing? Or are you seeking some form of human connection? We'll go back to our loneliness. So one of the things that I committed to when we helped build Crisis Text Line is that we would use machine learning and natural language processing and other AI tools for augmentation, not automation. Why? Because the greatest gift we can give people is a recognition that another human is willing to devote the time to hear you. And that is something that is so much beyond what is the actual things that are being said. The reality is the things that are being said by our trained counselors, sometimes they're better than AI, oftentimes they're not. Sometimes humans are terrible. But the recognition that someone is there, someone human is willing to be there. That is powerful. And so I think it's about us recognizing what this is, because those AIs are real fun for a bit, but then they don't fulfill that basic itch to connect, right? And connect in all sorts of different ways. And they fill it to a certain degree, and they fill it more likely when you are in a place where you're struggling with other things. Right. And so that's also important to recognize is like, when are people struggling and do we even acknowledge that? Right. Until we're at a much more toxic place. So this is where for me, it's like, yeah, you're right. The data quality for these general purpose things in the United States in English for a certain subset of the population goes much better with large amounts of stuff on the internet. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? At the end of the day, for me, I even just go something simple with my kids. I'm really annoying a parent sometimes. And I'm just like asking them about the environmental cost of every, Dali image they make. I think it's so annoyed they stop making them. Because it's just like, really? Was that worth it? Right? You get to see the fires we have in our backyard. Is it worth it? Right? And so this is that moment of like, when do we pay the true costs? Because those true costs for building those systems are environmental, and they're about destroying social fabrics and social relationships like Reddit and Stack Overflow and other communities by actively treating people as something that can be exploited. So if you start paying the costs, it's like, yeah, it might be great, but is it worth it? Not for me. I think a lot of it has to do with human connection more than and building social fabrics than it does just like a cool toy to play with. So
Thank you so much.
no worries.
Great. I think that's us on time. So let's give a round of applause for us.
Thank you all for staying so late. Much appreciated.
Thank
Go
you for your
enjoy
great
the
questions
darkness.
too. And then the couple of faculty who are joining us for dinner, so we'll join up and head out together sometime soon.
I'm gonna send you an article about Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Oh,
Uh, they've done a lot of work on that in the last few years. You know that.
a lot of work on which part?
On Hannah Arendt and Eichmann institution, there's like a whole nother chapter since about 2000.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
Peterson.
so it,
She's so fascinating.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming by. Have a good night. How many water